everybody, I'm Cindy Booz. I'm the author of 52 Days of Grace, available on Amazon and at Village Books here in Bellingham. I'd like to welcome you to Writings on the Doorframe. Today we are going to be taking a break from the Legacy series where I'm working through the loss of my mom, which happened a few weeks ago, and I wanted to address something that I've been seeing in our culture about the way that God tends to show himself in our lives in a time of crisis. I was recently looking at some videos of music on YouTube, and I was reading in the comments below, and a man was giving his testimony about a time that he was in great pain, and he called out to Jesus, and he pled with Jesus in his name, and through his blood, would he please heal him? And then he said he felt an experience where the Spirit came on him like the rushing of wind, and he felt an electricity flow through his body. And then he said when the Spirit left the room, then sure enough, he was healed. And I'm not discounting what he experienced. I've heard other people talk about this kind of experience, but I'm questioning whether that really is God's Spirit. Does he work this way? Does he work in big, spectacular, electric ways? Or does he show himself in other ways? And what happens if he doesn't show up in the way that we expect him to? Does that mean that he let us down? Does that mean that he's not being who we think he should be? Well, probably, because he's God and we're not. And so I really wanted to address that today. And I think when a crisis hits, we kind of do expect big things from God, right? I mean, I'm this way. I know about a year ago, our house sold. It was a house in South Carolina that we'd had on the market for a year, and no bites. People looking, but nobody offering. So when we got an offer, we were excited. Yay, God is at work and he's providing for our needs. Well, the problem was that we had to pay a lot of money in order to sell the house because the market had not recovered quite as much as it had in this part of the country. And so in order to sell it, we had to take a loss. Well, we were trusting God that he was going to provide, and we just thought he would provide in a supernatural way that would show everyone that he is God, he is our God, he is the Lord our God. And we stepped out on a limb for him. Does this resonate with any of you? I even spoke words of faith to the attorney. I didn't know who this attorney was, or his wife, who was his secretary, and I told her, I just trust that God's going to provide. Well, the deadline came and went, and we still didn't have the money, so we had to take out cash advances in order to cover the cost, so that we would not be taken to court. That's how much on a limb we went out for God, as the way we thought of it. So, did God let us down? It kind of felt like he did. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to look at Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18 to 19. We're going to look there for answers. When we need answers, we need to look in God's Word. So to give you a little bit of a background on Elijah, he was a prophet during the time of Ahab, who was one of the most evil kings. God's word said that he did more to provoke God's anger than all the kings before him. And then he married a woman named Jezebel, who was a worshiper of Baal. And because of that, he began to worship Baal, and he led the country, God's people, into worshiping Baal. And he built temples to Baal and altars. And so God sent Elijah to proclaim judgment on the nation of Israel under Ahab's leadership. There would be a drought, and that would lead to a famine. And Elijah himself, although he was there in the region, he was spared. God sent him to a brook, and he was given food by a raven, and then later a widow who had nothing, but the Lord provided for the widow's son, and for Elijah through flour and oil that just never ran out. It was never exhausted. So after a few years, you can imagine not having any rain for a few years. The famine was pretty bad in Samaria. There was no rain, and God told Elijah to go back to King Ahab and say that God is going to send rain. Well, Ahab had it out for Elijah, because he pretty much was blaming this drought on Elijah and on Elijah's God. So anyone who followed Elijah or followed God then was on his hit list. He kind of was on a witch hunt to destroy all of those who aligned themselves with God, because he saw them as the cause of the famine. And then now God is asking Elijah to go to Ahab and tell him it's going to rain now. Well, Elijah was kind of like public enemy number one. But he did end up going to Ahab, and of course Ahab blamed Elijah. But Elijah told Ahab, now this is pretty bold, actually, Ahab, you're the one to blame, because you did not do what God said. You abandoned him and you followed Baal instead. Well, then I'm sure a lot of you know the big showdown that Elijah had with the prophets of Baal. There were 450 prophets of Baal, and there were 400 Asherah prophets. And there was this big showdown. There were 2 altars. They each set up an altar, each sacrificing a bull. And, then all the people assembled there as well on Mount Carmel, so that they could see who was the real God. Whoever was the real God, was it God, the Lord of Israel, or was it Baal? Whoever was the real one would light the altars on fire, and then they would know that was the real God. Well, Elijah confronted the people of Israel as they assembled there and said, stop wavering. You need to choose either God, the Lord, or you choose Baal. Which are you going to choose? And they didn't say a word. So, in their silence, they were pretty much saying, you know what, I want it all. I want the pleasure that comes from following Baal, but I want the blessing of God. Can I have it all? Doesn't that sound familiar? We want it all. We want to be able to follow Jesus, but we want to be able to do the things that displease him because it pleases us. But we've got to choose. Now, Elijah, he thought he was the only prophet left. He really wasn't, but he felt like he was. But they set up their 2 altars with the bulls, and the God who answers by fire is the true God. They all agreed. So the Baal worshipers, they were calling on Baal. They were crying out to him for hours. And then they were dancing around, and then Elijah started tormenting him. Couldn't you hear it? He's probably saying, oh, why don't you say it a little louder? Maybe your God's asleep. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe you need to scream at the top of your lungs. And then they even started cutting themselves, as was their custom. And this went on all day. Well, finally, Elijah said, okay, enough. And he called all the people over, and he reassembled the altar. Maybe it got knocked down by all the revelry, by the Baal worshipers who were trying so hard to get Baal to answer. He put 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel as the altar, and then he put the wood, and he put the pieces of the bull that he was sacrificing. Then he even had them pour water over the sacrifice that went into a trench that was around the altar. And then he prayed, and I want to read to you the prayer. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And at that, the fire of the Lord came down and consumed the sacrifice, the wood the sacrifice was on, even the stones, and the soil underneath it, and it even licked up all the water that was in the trench. Wow, that must have been spectacular, because all the people fell to the ground and they cried, "The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God." I mean, surely if you were there, it doesn't matter. Even, I think, the staunchest atheist would fall to the ground and cry out, "The Lord He is God." And then all the prophets of Baal were slaughtered in the Kishon Valley, and Elijah told Ahab, he went back in Ahab's presence and said, "Go eat and drink, because rain is coming." Well, then Elijah, he went up on Mount Carmel and he saw the clouds coming. And so he warned Ahab, you need to start going to Jezreel, which is his winter home, because to get ahead of the rains, because otherwise he'd be stuck there. So God gave Elijah supernatural strength to be able to run 20 miles faster than a chariot, a horse-driven chariot was able to go. And he actually beat Ahab to Jezreel. Now, think about that. Elijah saw God's faithfulness, right? He saw his power, his might. He saw how he provided. He was bold. He was courageous and confident knowing that God had his back, that God was there with him. But then Jezebel got wind of what had happened, that Elijah was responsible for killing all of those prophets of Baal. Those were her prophets. And she was out to get him. And she threatened his life. And all of a sudden, Elijah was in the middle of a crisis. He lost all his confidence. All that faith that he just showed, it was gone. He doubted. Fear took over Elijah, and he ran for his life. He forgot God's might. He forgot that God was with him. He felt all alone. It didn't matter before that he thought he was the only prophet, but now it mattered a whole lot. He was discouraged. Can you relate? Have you ever been in a situation like that? We all have. Things don't go the way that we think they should have, and we feel like God has abandoned us, and we're all alone. And now, don't you care, Lord? Don't you care? Don't you see the predicament I'm in? Are you going to show up? Where's the fire now coming down from heaven? I need you now, and you're not here. Or so we think. That's how we feel. Well, God met Elijah right where he was. He sent a ministering angel to him, who ministered to him and gave him food and water. And then Elijah was able to kind of regather his strength, and he traveled 40 miles to Mount Horeb, which is called the Mountain of God, which is another name for Mount Sinai, which you might recognize as the place where Moses saw the burning bush, and it's also where he received the 10 Commandments, and he was able to speak to God. He was seeking God's presence. Can you see that? He's going to the place where he knew God had spoken to his ancestors. He wanted to hear from God. And that's us too, in our weakest moments, when we're vulnerable. We want to hear from God. But a lot of times we look in the wrong place for him. And then Elijah was saying, I've been zealous for you. Meaning, I've been jealous, like you're jealous, Lord. Intolerant of the unfaithfulness of the people. Burning with zeal for the Lord. He was zealous as God is for his own honor. As it says in Numbers 26:11. Because Israel, he was saying, Israel has rejected your covenant, has broken down your altars, killed your prophets, and here I am all alone, and now they're trying to kill me. Can't you just hear his discouragement? He just feels so alone and like God has abandoned him as well. And how did God answer his worries? With his very presence. He said, go stand on the mountain and I'll pass by. And then a wind came. It was a powerfully destructive wind. But the scriptures say God was not in the wind. And then an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And then a fire, but God was not in the fire. Where was God? He was in a gentle blowing or a gentle whisper. And then Elijah wrapped his face with his cloak and he came back to the cave. You know, God was there in the big moments, in the showdown. It was obvious, right? It was in your face, obvious. God was there. But where was God in Elijah's personal moment of need? He was there in a very easy to miss way. And he's there for us too. And a lot of times it's easy for us to miss because it's not big, spectacular, in your face. So here's the lesson. Where are we looking for God to work? In revealing earth-shattering truth? In some kind of big, powerful transformation? Or big, spectacular healing? Or, like I was looking for, a supernatural provision? And how do we expect for God to show up in our situation? Are we looking for maybe a showdown with offenders? You know, like the prophets of Baal showdown? Or maybe victory over persecution that we're receiving? Or maybe a blessing of material wealth or worldly success? Something spectacular that everyone will see and is unmistakably God. Well, we may be looking in the wrong place because he may show up in the quiet places of vulnerability, in our own weaknesses, in ways that we least expect, to comfort, to change our heart, or to minister to us. And when he does answer, it may be really easy to ignore because it's so quiet and gentle and unexpected. It may be personal, only for me and for you. Not a public display of God's blessing, some kind of vindication, but just personal, ministering to our heart. It may not address the fear directly. Like, did you hear God say anything about Jezebel? Like, I'm going to protect you from Jezebel, don't worry. No. In fact, it may not even bring a whole lot of comfort as far as our protection goes when God shows up. You know, God didn't give Elijah any indication, like I said, that he was going to protect him from Jezebel. Remember, we walk by faith, not by sight, right? We believe what we know is to be true, not what we feel, or not what we want to experience, but what we know to be true. So here's what we can expect. We know that God is righteous and just, so he's going to do the right thing. We know that God is to be glorified, so he's going to do what honors him and is according to his purpose. And we know that God works in his own timetable using his own methods. But he does not leave us or forsake us. Therefore, when he answered Elijah, what did he have Elijah do? He had him anoint an enemy king, and this enemy king would end up punishing Israel. He also anointed a new king of Israel who would destroy the Baal worshippers, and he anointed a new prophet, Elisha, who would replace Elijah. And he would point the people back to God. And what about Jezebel? Well, we find out a little later that she was thrown out the window at Jezreel and her body was eaten by dogs, just as Elijah had prophesied. You can read about that in 2 Kings 9, verses 30 to 37. So just remember, when we are feeling alone and discouraged, remember, like Elijah did, he was so alone. He felt so alone and discouraged. Remember that God often meets us right where we are in a still, small voice. And that when crisis hits, the crisis could be cancer. It could be a financial crisis. It could be divorce. It could be bankruptcy. It could be a job loss. It could be the death of a loved one. It could be some other kind of disease. When this crisis hits, let's not miss God at work because we expect the spectacular, like the spectacular healing or the dramatic provision or some public display of vindication. But instead, let's seek his purpose and listen for his still, small voice speaking to us in our most vulnerable places. We can trust him. We can trust him. He's proven himself over and over again to be faithful. And this crisis is just an opportunity to see God at work. But it's going to be in the way he chooses. We can count on him to do what is right, to glorify himself, and to work in his own time, and to always be there. So the question that I asked at the beginning, did God let us down when he didn't answer in the way we expected? No, not at all. He's there. He's faithful, and he's always been there. And I want you to listen to Love and the Outcomes song called No Mistaking It's You. I'm going to leave a link in the comments below. And please let me know how I can pray for you. Maybe you're in your crisis moment right now. Let me know how I can pray for you in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any of the content I publish every Monday. And I just want to thank you for stopping by to Writings on the Doorframe.